Alright, I've had enough of this. Much like the rest of the content in Phase 4, Loki is an absolute abomination. Not just in terms of its boneheaded world building, not just in terms of its own sloppy narrative, not even just in terms of its abysmal treatment of its titular character, but crucially, everything the MCU spent 2008 to 2019 setting up. I've loved Marvel Comics since I was 8 years old. I saw the first Avengers 5 times when it came out in cinemas, and one of those was on a date with a girl I didn't even like. Point is, from Iron Man to Endgame, my arse has been in the theatre, and the MCU was the main reason I even became interested in film in the first place. And now, this is the last MCU outing I'll ever put any personal stake in. What? Why? I hear you ask. Well, I'll tell you. Episode 1 starts with a recap from Endgame, re-establishing that we're following the Loki who escapes Avengers Tower in 2012 during the time heist, as a result of Tony Stark and Scott Lang's botched mission to retrieve the Tesseract. All good so far. Whoops, looks like I spoke too soon. Loki went from escaping in a standing position to launching himself into the Gobi Desert at terminal velocity from a very high altitude. I thought the stones obeyed your thoughts, but I guess not, unless Loki wanted to fall uncontrollably into the ground spine first. Why not just, I don't know, teleport here normally? Oh, the landing destroyed his restraints. Did you not have another idea to get out of those besides fucking gravity? One of the greatest minds in the MCU, and Loki either can't control his own thoughts, or he did this on purpose, which arguably makes him a whole lot stupider. Oh well. Once he dusts himself off, Loki is approached by some Mongolian farmers, so jumps on a rock to establish dominance, repeating his speech from the first Avengers, but inflected in such a way that makes me wonder if he didn't lose some serious IQ points when he hit the ground. I am Loki, of Asgard, and I am burdened with glorious purpose. Now, as we all remember, this glorious purpose used to refer to Loki's plan to subjugate the Earth using the Chitauri army, who are now all dead. So did he just forget this? Or does he have a new glorious purpose involving 4 confused Mongolian farmers? Or did the writers just take a line from a better script, slot it into a completely different situation, and expect it to have the same effect? See, Loki saying this in Avengers made him threatening, but also pointed toward a more unhinged mental state after we saw him in the first Thor film. What has he seen in the depths of space? Who exactly found him? What kind of power have they given him access to? And what has he had to give up to gain that access? In short, what has happened to him? This intrigue came from taking a character we were familiar with and immediately making him unfamiliar, all in aid of creating a feeling of menace. In contrast, Loki saying this now makes him unfamiliar, but in aid of making him look flat out mentally deficient. A portal opens, and 3 grunts in riot gear walk out, and seem to be congregating near the Tesseract, which, Loki likely realises, he probably should have gone and picked up before trying to intimidate 4 confused strangers. He commands them not to touch it, but as he approaches, another portal opens, and Hunter B-15 enters the scene. She looks at some kind of device, saying that this is a standard sequence violation. After some kind of deduction process, she identifies Loki as a variant, and places him under arrest for crimes against the sacred timeline, under the power of the Time Variance Authority. Standard sequence violation against the sacred timeline. Okay, ignoring the enormous implications of a sacred timeline for a minute. First point, what precisely is Loki's crime here? Teleporting away? Seems pretty small to me. What was he supposed to do with the Tesseract? Are Scott, Tony and Hulk not also in trouble for knocking it over to him? Because if Loki couldn't get hold of it under his own power, they surely should be. Second point, I realise this is probably taking place during the time heist, but if the time heist is all happening pretty much simultaneously, I can think of a few things that the TVA should have intervened with already. But don't worry, we'll get there. Anyway, Loki, surprised at this strange new technology, casts an illusion of himself to distract the Minutemen while sneaking up to stab them all in the back. Oh no, hold on. He responds to B-15's demands by casting multiple duplicates of himself, obscuring her vision of him while he escapes, disguised as one of the Mongolian farmers. No! Wait, that's not right. He responds to B-15's demands by conjuring his throwing knives, ready to kill her and her team before they can even come close to him. Shit! No! I'm sorry! What actually happens is that Loki responds to Hunter B-15's demands with a threat, then immediately puts himself within easy range to be smacked in the face. Yep, he's hit with a baton that slows him down to 1/16th speed, thus allowing B-15 to put a collar round his neck. It goes on for quite a while to allow time for audience laughter, and it's very funny watching his face wobble. In the past, I've said that Loki's character changes as a result of watching clips of his life. I was wrong. We now see that he was completely out of character since coming through the portal. Coincidentally, when these writers started being in control of him. Or maybe that's not a coincidence thinking about it. Loki is then picked up and arrested, and B-15 instructs her underlings to reset the timeline with a reset charge, which disintegrates everything in the immediate area. And although they're shown to be limited to a finite radius, I think we're supposed to assume that setting this device off resets a Loki and a Tesseract back into 2012 Avengers Tower, even though that's not shown. But we'll revisit that in episode 2. We cut to see Loki brought into the TVA, looking around to see other people being arrested. Loki makes an attempt to run, though where he expects to escape to, or what he expects to accomplish, is a mystery to me. So why did he do this? Well, it gives Hunter B-15 an excuse to use a device that resets him back to where he started. Outraged, Loki, despite being established as one of the greatest minds in the MCU, perplexingly then tries to run again, to absolutely nowhere, only to be reset a second time. See, if you have to establish how things work in your setting, or you have to create a comedic scene, and the only way you can think to make it work is to arbitrarily lower IQ points off your protagonist, I'm of the opinion you should try and think of something else. In this instance, imagine if Loki, instead of trying to run the second time, smiles and tries to summon his daggers, only to be told his magic won't work here. You can play it up for laughs, but the benefit of this is that Loki, despite not being familiar with the rules of his surroundings, would still be testing his parameters in more ways than one, demonstrating his mental agility even if it's not successful in this exact circumstance. This way, you get your yucks, but Loki's character isn't diminished in the process. However, writing it this way means you now miss out on a later opportunity to make him look like an ineffectual dumbass, which is clearly what the show is angling for. But still. B-15 gives the Tesseract to Casey, a receptionist, who puts it in a drawer and says that Tesseract sounds dumb. Tee-hee. Cut to next scene, and Loki is stripped down for all the thirsty Facebook mums of the world and put into a variant outfit. He is then dropped into another room, and a man tells him to verify that this is everything that he has ever said, whilst pushing a stack of paper toward him that looks wildly too small for someone anywhere near Thor's age of 1500, and that's ignoring that this is specifically Loki, whose main attribute is being verbose. Loki says what, and this is absurd, printing off 2 more pieces of paper for him to sign, and after a brief standoff, Loki obliges. Sorry, are you sure I'm watching the Loki TV show? Do you mean to tell me that the God of Mischief wouldn't go out of his way to grief the living shit out of this guy? Do you mean to tell me his instant reaction to seeing this is to not just run his mouth? Well, I'm sorry, show, but Loki doesn't just obey for the sake of obedience. I don't believe you, no matter how much you try to convince me that one of Marvel's greatest villains was always a weak-willed, unimaginative, flaccid sap. Loki then drops into a different room with a metal detector, where a TVA employee asks him to confirm that he is not a fully robotic being, was born an organic creature, and possesses what many cultures would call a soul. Loki, confused, asks if many people don't know whether they're robots. The employee takes this as confirmation, begging the question of why he bothered asking at all, then adds that if he is a robot, the metal detector will melt him from the inside out. With some trepidation, Loki walks through, creating a photo of his temporal aura. Loki asks what that is, but the employee doesn't answer. Much like this scene, temporal auras are not mentioned, or even relevant ever again. And furthermore, you'd think that anything causing trouble for the sacred timeline would need to be terminated regardless of whether it was a robot or not. So yeah, why did we bother even filming this scene? Loki is taken to an empty room with a queuing system, and the prisoner from before is told to take a ticket. He asks if this is a deli, and refuses, walking through without taking one. Loki is instructed likewise, but unlike the mere mortal, actually obeys. Again, just like Loki wouldn't. Then throws out his arms petulantly, saying that he shouldn't be here, triggering an infographic for the TVA. Long ago there was a multiversal war, with timelines battling for supremacy, nearly resulting in the destruction of everything. But the all-knowing timekeepers reorganised the multiverse into the sacred timeline, which is now managed by the TVA. Sometimes, variants veer off the path, which apparently can be anything from starting an uprising to being late for work. But whatever the case, deviating from the sacred timeline causes a Nexus event, which will veer off and create a multiverse again without proper management. The TVA are that management, and will hunt down variants to be prosecuted for their crimes, resetting their previous self to ensure that the proper timeline is preserved. Loki is rightfully incredulous, but whoop! The prisoner from earlier is having some trouble after not taking a ticket, and, after a very clearly botched take, is disintegrated. Seriously, this is a scene in a show produced with Disney/Marvel Studios money. Did you not feel like doing a second take? Were you even paying enough attention to notice this guy flubbed his line? Fucking hell. Loki, horrified, scrambles to make sure he's in possession of his ticket, humorously whipping it out like he's an airship passenger in The Last Crusade. Now, while the opening credits roll, allow me to ask, what the fuck? You can be a variant if you're late for work, but not if you're building a literal time machine to travel back in time, going back in time and fighting yourself, then stopping that fight by giving your past self news that his best friend is actually alive, going back in time and conversing with your mother before she dies, going back in time to steal Mjolnir, going back in time to stop Peter Quill from getting the Power Stone by punching his fucking lights out, going back in time to take Pym particles so you can go back in time more, going back in time and meeting your father before you're born while stealing an Infinity Stone, going back in time and dying in the past to get the Soul Stone for your mates, going back in time and, while your previous self is fighting aliens down the street, convincing the Ancient One to give you the Time Stone by telling her about future events she has no knowledge of, killing a previous self that travelled to the future, going back in time and making Thanos aware of how he is killed by Thor, going back in time to pretend to be in league with Hydra, going back in time and carrying out a plan to give your past self a heart attack, going back in time and having a space raccoon extract an Infinity Stone out of your ex-girlfriend's bum, going forward in time with your entire intergalactic army and getting snapped out of existence, jumping forward from 2014 to 2023 and living there from now on, going back in time to live in the past well into old age with your old flame, thus making it so she never met her husband from a previous timeline, going forward in time, making friends with the future version of your sister, working with her to kill her past self, then kicking the lover of your dead future self in the testicles. Oh, and here's a good one. Snapping half of all living creatures out of existence completely at random, creating infinite potential timelines where the opposite Avengers survive, only some of them do, none of them do, and everything in between. And that's not even considering non-superhuman characters whose potential existence or potential non-existence will have an influence on things. I can't think how that would cause problems for the sacred timeline! But most crucially, going back in time and knocking the Tesseract into the way of Loki, directly causing a Nexus event to take place when it couldn't have without your direct involvement. That's all fine, is it? Because judging by how fast these guys are on Loki's case for teleporting somewhere, it shouldn't be. We cut to a courtroom, where Loki is charged with Sequence Violation 7/2089. Without providing any explanation to someone who would have zero chances of knowing what that means, the judge asks how Loki pleads, and Loki says, not guilty. The judge asks who they should have, and Loki very rightfully says the Avengers, very rightfully pointing out that he only came into possession of the Tesseract because they travelled through time. He claims to have deduced this because he smells Tony's cologne twice. Yep. The judge says that's quite an accusation, but Loki doubles down and says it's them they're after, and he'd be more than happy to help them. But the judge says that they're not here to talk about the Avengers, because what they did was supposed to happen, unlike Loki's escape. So, Loki's crime was not going to Mongolia and talking to some farmers. It was the escape itself that created the warrant for his arrest. That's a statement in the script. However, if the Avengers' actions in Endgame are supposed to happen, this means that Tony and Scott's botching of the mission is sanctioned. But why does it botch? Because Loki escapes with the Tesseract, removing it from the game. That's the direct cause for Tony and Steve to go and pick it up in the military base in the 70s, as well as the Pym particles which will later be stolen and will allow Thanos and his army to travel to the future, all of which are events that are supposed to happen. Meaning that Loki's crime against the sacred timeline is actually accommodating events of the sacred timeline that literally could not happen without his crime taking place. Now, this just doesn't make sense on its face, but for the minute, let's give the show the benefit of the doubt. Why is Loki's teleportation not permitted, but all the time travel hijinks carried out by the Avengers are? Because you could explain this by saying that the TVA let that stuff all slide on the proviso that Cap returns all the stones, thus erasing any damage that may cause. It's not something that's explicitly said, but if we're helping the show out by allowing it to be true, this now means that not only does Loki's theft of the Tesseract facilitate events of the sacred timeline taking place, but it also facilitates Cap being able to go back and undo the damage the time heist has caused. Meaning even if we help this out, it still fucks itself on a conceptual level. Yet it doesn't seem to care, or even notice. Anyway, despite all this, Loki is now arbitrarily and unfairly trapped in a kangaroo court with no hope of escape and a 100% chance of getting horribly melted from existence. And we have no choice but to assume that this is the TVA's general code of conduct, meaning that variants, people who cannot possibly have any knowledge of their crimes or of the TVA's rules, are by definition completely unable to defend themselves from being sentenced to a horrible death, begging the question of why the TVA don't just have Minutemen melt variants on site, rather than wasting their energy creating this farcical system with collars and uniforms and infographics and signatures and robot detectors and tickets and courtrooms. Do you see how this setting just crumbles under any kind of scrutiny? Now, I've been on this subject for a while, so I'd like to take this opportunity to compare this premise over just having the MCU function as a multiverse. Not the multi-dimensional kind described in Doctor Strange, but a multiple timeline multiverse as depicted in the Spider-Verse movie. The trouble with having had Endgame already depict time travel, but then adding in an oppressive time travel control agency after the fact, kind of begs the question of why these guys aren't present in that plot, trying to stop the Avengers fucking about. And in a meta sense, we know why. It's because it'd make Endgame too complicated. But the trouble is, in-universe, even if the Avengers' hijinks are sanctioned on the proviso that Cap returns the stones to the timeline, by adding the concept of the sacred timeline to the MCU, we've now created this insane situation where it requires 2012 Loki to simultaneously A. be arrested by Thor and taken back to Asgard to facilitate the plot of Dark World, but also B. remove the Tesseract from play in Endgame to facilitate the rest of the TVA-sanctioned time heist happening. Meaning that if the time heist is meant to happen, and Loki's removal of the Tesseract is instrumental to that, this means that the sacred timeline requires both A and B Lokis to exist. But, because the B Loki is creating Nexus energy due to being a variant, the sacred timeline also requires the TVA to prune a B Loki variant every single time it happens in the timeline to reset him back to an A Loki variant. So despite the TVA presumably having an already heaping workload that must come from just stopping random nobodies across the cosmos from being late for work, or pruning potentially limitless variants who accidentally survived the snap due to random chance, they are absolutely cool with allowing the time heist to happen, even though it creates a moment that theoretically generates more Loki variants than any other moment in history every single time it happens. Can you see how the script is bending over backwards to incorporate this time travel premise into somewhere it doesn't fit? Compare this to how a multiple timeline multiverse would deal with this, where these problems are completely null and non-existent. Not only would you, as a writer, no longer need to fail to even half justify why the Avengers are allowed to fuck about without any repercussion from the TVA, but in this scenario, Loki's escape would simply create a new timeline where he isn't present for Dark World. Done. But back to the episode. Loki tries to fight back, but finds himself unable to use his powers, much to the amusement of everyone in attendance, further making him look like an ineffectual fool who probably should have tried doing this earlier. He is then sentenced, I assume to be horribly melted, without adequate explanation or benefit of the doubt, despite his defence being completely valid, and despite the fact that the sacred timeline happened to drop the Tesseract in his lap through no knowledge or fault of his own. Luckily, Owen Wilson persuades the judge to let Loki go so he can use him for his own purposes. He's just got back from investigating a squad of Minutemen who were all stabbed to death during a routine check, with their reset charge stolen, and he seems to think Loki is the key to solving it all. More on that in episode 2. After some CGI piss showing the TVA, Owen Wilson introduces himself as Agent Mobius. He says they're going someplace to talk, and Loki, very perplexingly, says he doesn't like to talk. Why did he say this? It's so Mobius can say that he does like to lie, which is what he just did, because he loves to talk, following that up with a mime of a sock puppet, while mockingly whispering, "Talkie, talkie." Ha! Loki is led to Mobius' office, and he repeats back the premise and calls it absurd. Glad we agree. Sadly, that's then followed up with Mobius saying that he thought he didn't like to talk, leaving Loki, very uncharacteristically, without an answer. Loki remarks that Mobius' office looks like a room that'd be good to kill him in, and Mobius comments that Loki has trouble with trust, planting a nice, blatant signpost to his oncoming character arc for everyone to see. Loki says that trust is for children and dogs, and there is only one person you can trust. Mobius mocks him further by saying he should put that on a t-shirt, and Loki actually asks a very pertinent question. If the TVA oversees all of time, how have I never heard of you until now? 'Cause you never needed to. You've always lived within your set path. I live by whatever path I choose. Sure you do. Nice. So if you deviate from the events of the movies even a little bit, you get melted out of existence and reset until another you does it properly. I'll let that hang there for a bit, but you bet your ass on coming back to it. For now, just let the enormity of such a statement settle in. Mobius offers him a seat, and Loki looks like he's about to go for him, and actually gets quite close before being reset back to where he started. I guess Mobius didn't fancy any security detail, probably because Loki is no longer threatening as of 20 minutes ago, but shit, Mobius, he's got Asgardian strength. What if you don't react fast enough the next time? What if you fumble your device? You don't want someone else here watching your back? You're being surprisingly lax considering less than a day ago, this guy had killed 80 people in 2 days, led an invasion against New York, stabbed his own brother when his guard was down. Perhaps you forgot. Perhaps everybody forgot. Oh well. Mobius asks Loki to cooperate, and Loki says that's not his forte, despite the fact it seems to have been all episode. Mobius then says he specialises in the pursuit of dangerous variants. Loki asks if he means him, but Mobius says no, only particularly dangerous variants. He calls him a pussycat, further cementing that this Loki, despite being from 2012 and therefore should be at his most unhinged and ruthless, is completely ineffectual and obedient, not even worth keeping a constant eye on. Yay. Mobius asks Loki what he'd do if he returned to his timeline, and Loki says he intends to reclaim his throne. Mobius asks what he'll do once he has it, and the show actually pretends to address the fact that Loki wants to rule only for the sake of ruling. I'm not against this in concept, since it's something that's actually true to the character, but Mobius presumably realises that the current conversation thread actually gives Loki some dimension, instead of creating an easy chance to undermine him, so hastily deviates by absurdly suggesting that Loki becomes the king of space, and Loki threatens him to mock him if he dares. Loki, have you had a full frontal lobotomy? He's been mocking you since you got in the elevator, for fuck's sake. Mobius says that he's a fan of Loki, but asked why someone with so much range only wants to rule. I would have made it easy for them. People like easy. The first and most oppressive lie ever uttered was the Song of Freedom. How's that one go? For nearly every living thing, choice breeds shame and uncertainty and regret. There's a fork in every road, yet the wrong path always taken. Good, yeah. You said nearly every living thing, so I'm guessing you don't fall into that category? The timekeepers have built quite the circus, and I see the clowns are playing their parts to perfection. Mobius then calls him a big metaphor guy, saying it makes him sound super smart. Loki's answer? I am smart. Ugh, these nebulous, substanceless, disconnected phrases literally only exist for Mobius to easily mock and ridicule them. But Loki just keeps going and going and going. It's not to say that Loki doesn't use flowery language, but what is he trying to accomplish here? Is he trying to intimidate? Is he trying to persuade? Is he trying to unbalance, or goad, or manipulate, or impress? What is his motivation in saying these things to Mobius? Because fucked if I know. Just keep the surface level flowery language, I guess. That's Loki, done. Mobius then plays footage from the Avengers. A bold move, considering this show clearly didn't watch it that closely. Then says that for someone who wants to rule, Loki sure does lose a lot. Both Loki and Mobius completely ignore the implications that come with Loki's failures being part of the sacred timeline and the will of the timekeepers, but whatever, I'm sure Loki wouldn't be the kind of person to point out the inherent stupidity in Mobius smugly criticising him for personal shortcomings that the TVA orchestrate and enforce. Instead of doing that, Loki hangs his head in frustration while Mobius asks if Loki likes hurting people, making them feel small and afraid and little. Mobius calls him a murderer, and Loki calls himself a liberator, and Mobius plays the clip of him stealing the eyeball in Stuttgart, remarking on how much he is enjoying the act of inflicting pain. Instead of revelling in this, Loki says he doesn't have to play this game, since he is a god, and Mobius says that for the god of mischief, he wouldn't describe any of his actions as mischievous, though he does have a talent for doing awful things and escaping. Loki then says, "What can I say? I'm a mischievous scamp," and good fucking god, this is such dreck. I don't believe for a second that Loki would give a shit about being called a murderer, or for being criticised for dominating his will on people he considers lesser than him. He does enjoy creating mayhem and inflicting pain. That's his character. He is a villain. His mischievous nature was his way of dealing with his self-perception as the lesser favoured brother, and that nature was amplified when he was snubbed for the throne. The realisation that he was a frost giant raised to believe himself an Asgardian prince, and by extension had been little more than a bargaining chip for Odin to use in case of rebellion, was what started him on his path of full-fledged villainy. All the pain and insecurity and confusion that must have come with that titanic identity crisis has always been Loki's justification for his actions. In his mind, he's paid his dues far more than his fair share. He's the victim in all this, and he deserves recompense, and in the pursuit of that recompense, guilt and remorse are the last things Loki's going to feel. Now to me, that sounds like prime material for a character deconstruction, but apparently we're not interested in even alluding to any of that. Just have Loki forget his entire character so we can have a completely one-sided conversation where Owen Wilson scolds him like a schoolteacher ridiculing a child, please. Oh, Loki was DB Cooper, by the way. Why? Who the fuck knows? It was a lost bet with Thor, apparently. Stealing dollar bills from a plane by pretending to have a bomb because, gee, that's just got Thor written all over it, doesn't it? No? But is this in any way relevant later? Also no. I'm not kidding. This scene comes out of absolutely nowhere, is over within a minute, then is never brought up or referenced ever again. I literally don't know why they put all this time and effort into creating something that's ultimately nothing short of an incongruous and bizarre waste of time. And you know what? I bet that you watching now, forgot that you even watched it until I mentioned it. Mobius is so jazzed about this little revelation, and Loki says he supposes that he had the Timekeeper's seal of approval for that one. Mobius says not to think of it in terms of approval or disapproval, muddying the water without any explanation. He asks Loki what he's running from, and Loki, becoming angry, tries to leave, then gets reset again. Mobius mocks him, and Loki, frustrated, says that he was just standing up to make a point. Mobius invites him to try again, but Loki childishly pouts, saying, "It won't be as meaningful now." Mobius gives him leave to walk around, and Loki does so. Wow. Less than 20 minutes, and the character we're all watching this show for is utterly unrecognisable as a meek and obedient little dog. Get shit on, Odin. These guys needed less than half an hour to accomplish what you've been struggling with for 15 centuries. Mobius says he wants Loki to be honest about why he does the things he does, and Loki gets frustrated, calling the TVA an illusion. A cruel, elaborate trick, conjured by the weak to inspire fear, a desperate attempt at control. He says that they parade about like the divine arbiters of the universe, and Mobius smiles and says that they are. Loki says his choices are his own, calling the TVA pathetic. He'll get what he is owed because of his own choice, not because they allow him to. Mobius asks if he is finished, and says he's going to start taking things seriously. Mobius then shows Loki footage from Darkworld, another film this show didn't pay attention to. Loki says this is a trick, but Mobius tells him that the TVA know his future, saying that he accidentally kills his mother, and it happens again and again and again because it's supposed to. For some reason, Mobius doubles down on asking if he enjoys hurting and killing. Loki threatens to kill him, and Mobius says, "Like he killed your mother." Loki gets angry and throws his chair through the hologram, nearly getting to Mobius again before being reset. Mobius says he was never meant to be king. He was born to cause pain and suffering and death, to allow others to achieve their best versions of themselves. If this blow-by-blow sounds interminable, that's probably something to do with my voice, to be fair. But it's probably also because this scene starts at the 20-minute mark and doesn't end until B-15 arrives at the 33-minute mark. Not only that, but it's because the scene offers nothing but Mobius mocking Loki ad infinitum, and Loki having no recourse but to feebly deny the things he says, while Mobius shows clips from a film some of us last saw 9 years ago, for 13 minutes straight. Doesn't sound like much, but considering the end credits start at the 45-minute mark, this means that nearly an entire third of this episode is this conversation. I don't want to overstate this, but I don't understand how, even if you just want to enjoy this show, people derive entertainment from it. A literal third of the episode is Loki taking shit from Owen Wilson whilst being forced to watch his own clips in a room he can't get out of. And instead of becoming angry at the TVA for orchestrating his defeats, instead of revelling in his evil deeds, instead of trying to unbalance or gain information about Mobius to use against him later, Loki completely folds under pressure, futilely loses his cool, and throws tantrums like a child, playing into this out-of-nowhere perception that he is, and always has been, utterly pathetic all along. Go and fuck yourself, show! Mobius helps Loki stand up, and B-15 re-enters to interrupt, saying they have a situation. Mobius, despite having nearly been successfully attacked by Loki on 2 separate occasions, perplexingly leaves him alone to his own devices, presumably believing he'll just sit there, because why wouldn't he? Re-entering the room without any attempt at caution and realising Loki has pickpocketed him. Holy shit! Competence! Well, maybe not competence, since Mobius had to be pretty stupid for this to happen, but half competence from this new Loki. But I guess we had to get away from that dog shit boring scene somehow, so cheers B-15. Wait, Loki can just use the tempad? There's no ID verification required? Any given variant can just steal any given tempad, press some buttons and do exactly what they want to do with it? What? Do you not want to put some security measures on the thing that allows people to travel through space and time? How fucking stupid are you, TVA? Has no variant in history ever stolen a tempad and caused you problems? I'm being facetious, the answer is yes, they have. While Mobius and B-15 search for him, Loki follows and ambushes Casey, and despite clearly being in earshot of another person, manages to actually have a conversation with him, despite his instant reaction being to call him a criminal. Loki says to give him the Tesseract, threatening to gut him like a fish. But joke's on him, because Casey doesn't know what a fish is. What? Because he works in the TVA, get it? No? Why does that mean he doesn't know what a fish is? Fish have been around so long they were instrumental to the evolution of humanity, How do you file paperwork about human variants for eternity without having ever come across fucking fish? I don't understand, what the fuck is this joke? Casey complies and opens up a drawer containing the Tesseract, which looks distinctly less glowy than usual, almost like the fake one we saw in the first Captain America film. Loki doesn't seem to notice this, even though he absolutely would, so I guess I'm just overthinking it looking like shit. But he looks down and sees that the drawer is actually full of Infinity Stones. Casey says they actually have a lot of them, so many that some of the guys use them as paperweights. Thanks guys, way to make 12 years of investment feel like a waste of time. Good job. Fuck the Infinity Saga. The writers of Loki say it's Paperweight Saga now. Fuck you, every character up to now. Everything you all struggled for over the last 12 years has amounted to absolutely nothing on the cosmic stage. Is this the greatest power in the universe? Loki asks. Probably, mate, but only up until the point we need something even more powerful than that. B-15 enters and tries to melt Loki, but he manages to reset himself back into Mobius's office. Loki then watches his most tear-jerking events of Ragnarok and Infinity War, utterly forgetting his cynicism about the TVA being an illusion and having a little cry. And all of social media cried with him, because if I've learned anything from the Twitter discourse surrounding this show, it sure is easy to make people cry. Fuck whether Loki, the character, will believe what he's seeing or uses information to his advantage. Sit back, guys. You did it. You wrote Loki cries. You got him in the palm of your hand. It's just that easy. Now, in all seriousness, I'm not against Loki having an emotional breakdown in concept, but considering the point between Avengers and Darkworld is where Loki is at his most angry, bitter, self-centered, proud, hateful and cynical, I simply don't buy his acceptance of this. Up to now he's believed the TVA to be an illusion, a TVA employee has been trying his best to unbalance, criticise and distress him, the Infinity Stones his master yearns to collect have been called paperweights, and now, right at his fingertips, he's found videos of the deaths of his loved ones as well as himself. I'm not saying he can't have emotions. His reaction to Frigga's death in Darkworld is among his stronger moments in the MCU, but he's not experiencing these events, he's merely watching them. We may know them to be true, but considering his incredulity toward everything he's being told, the idea that he doesn't just see this as a very elaborate trick, when it absolutely looks like one, is something I don't buy. Oddly, the crime being completely sincere here is what makes his entire sequence so jarring. It's almost as if the show is tricking its audience into generating acclaim for its awful writing, by creating a cheap emotional gut punch by making a fan favourite cry, cashing in on the emotional investment built up for years by better writers. But I'm sure this will be the only time that happens in this show, so back to the episode. B-15 catches up to Loki and they have a shitty fight, in which Loki manages to disconnect his collar and put it on B-15, allowing him to reset her before she can land a punch on him, and zapping her back to having another hilarious conversation with Casey, further showcasing that Minutemen, despite being the chosen enforcement for the divine arbiters of the universe, are pathetically incompetent, by extension making this premise all the more difficult for me to take seriously. Mobius corners Loki, only to find him despondently watching his future movies. Loki says he can't go back to his timeline now, then breaks down, saying he doesn't enjoy hurting people, but he has to hurt them, to maintain the illusion, the cruel elaborate trick, conjured by the weak to inspire fear, a desperate play for control. Mobius smiles at this admission, and says that he is impressed, that Loki does know himself. You've really got an agenda here, haven't you, show? It's almost like you're trying to tear something down that was pre-established and well-liked in favour of propping up your own creations later. But you wouldn't do that, would you, show? You? Mobius says he can't offer Loki salvation, but maybe he can offer something better. A variant has been killing their Minutemen. Loki, still sniffling, wobbly asks why he needs the god of mischief to help him. And Mobius says the variant they're chasing is, in fact, a Loki. Whoa. Cut to the teaser for next episode, in 19th century Oklahoma. The Minutemen are tracking an anachronistic device from the early 3rd millennium, as well as some oil on the ground. One theorises that some jackass has stolen a time machine to go and get rich. The other asks if they should go and look for him, but the first Minuteman says it's not worth the paperwork, and just to prune the device. Not even going to ask why someone using a time machine to go and massively inflate their wealth isn't a problem for the sacred timeline, but since the show just wants that to be yet another line we don't think about, I guess we'll leave that there. The scene ends with the variant Loki killing them all by lighting the oil on fire. Fuck knows why that was their plan against time cops, and possibly more perplexing that it works against time cops, but that's its own Pandora's box that I'll leave for next time. I'm just glad it's over. Never in my time did I think I'd see an MCU production have such open contempt for its fans on every conceivable level. Are you a Loki fan? Fuck you! Loki is a sallow, feeble weakling projecting an illusion of competence and always has been. Are you a fan of the Infinity Saga? Fuck you! The Infinity Stones are actually paperweights in the grand scheme of things, used by hapless desk drones who don't know what fish are. Are you a fan of rewatching the MCU? Fuck you! This was all on a predetermined path all along, and none of what we saw before was happening without approval from the TVA. Oh yes, I said I'd get back to that, didn't I? The problem with making that statement is that, well, kinda sucks the drama out of everything looking back, doesn't it? Whilst making the first Iron Man suit in the cave, if Tony got found out by the terrorists before he finished, everything would have been reset to allow him more time, making his achievement against such dangerous odds so much less remarkable. If Steve had been killed during his solo mission to save Bucky's unit from Hydra, he'd have been reset until he succeeded, meaning that earning the respect of the soldiers as Captain America is less down to his own merits, skills, or worth, and more down to this being the Timekeeper's preferred result. If Peter Quill had chosen not to save Gamora from dying in the cold expanse of space, he'd have been reset, taking away the significance of Peter finally choosing to put someone else's interest before his own by making it a prerequisite. If Wanda managed to save Cap from Crossbones' explosion without killing anyone, she'd have been reset until she did, detracting from the tragedy of the accident by making it unavoidable. If T'Challa had chosen to avenge his father by killing Zemo, he'd have been reset until he spared him, cheapening T'Challa's worthiness to be king by making his mercy a given. If Thor had gone for Thanos' head and stopped the snap, he would have been reset, making all of Thor's subsequent guilt surrounding that moment into a giant cosmic joke. He never could have stopped it, by order of the Timekeepers. If someone else did the final snap so Tony could have had a life with Pepper and Morgan, everything would have been reset until specifically Tony did it, removing the weight of such a selfless choice by making him the only person who could make it. And if Loki ever did defeat the Avengers, he'd have been reset until he lost. Thanks to this cute little premise, there was now never any danger. Just as the bad guys were always going to lose, the good guys were always going to win. They couldn't not. Failure just meant the heroes would get another shot until they got it right, infinitely. Nothing was ever hanging in the balance, nothing of any consequence anyway. None of those defining character moments belong to the characters. They can't choose to be anyone other than who the Timekeepers have decreed them to be. Each and every victory was already won, each and every character little more than a trolley on a set of rails, existing merely to perform a function. And the kicker is that the Timekeepers were the real heroes all along. Take that, Tony and Natasha. Your heroic sacrifices had to be signed off and accepted by someone in triplicate before you're allowed to go ahead unmelted. Why you'd establish this into your lore on purpose, I have no idea. It's about as perplexing as Loki's entrance. If the writers didn't do it on purpose, they've inadvertently reduced the actions of the heroes to mere items on a checklist in the context of their own world. If the writers did do it on purpose, they've also made a 23-film cinematic universe somehow feel small and inconsequential in order to prop up their own work. Neither explanation casts them in a great light, or makes you want to invest further time in future projects. And I'm working with context from episode 6, the restricted existence of a multiverse, TVA being constructed by someone other than the Timekeepers, the unleashing of the branches. None of that changes the fact that the TVA have been in control up until this point. None of that undoes the damage that retroactively causes. And if they just made the MCU function as a multiverse already, perhaps everything up till now could have come out unscathed. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, I guess. For now, we'll see what the rest of the series has to offer. It's not like it can get worse from here, right?